How many kids are in the house, Mrs. Philpott?
I'm 6 of them.
Have you any idea what's caused the fire?
I've no idea, mate, but it's been woke up all day long.
There's smoke everywhere.
There's no noise to be children. There's no noise to be children.
Now, the call you just heard was made in the early hours of the 11th of May 2012 from Mairead Philpott, a distressed, frantic and excruciating mother as she watches her family home go up in flames with her children trapped inside. And despite the heroic act of husband Mick Philpott and one of the next door neighbours as they climbed a ladder to an upstairs window and attempted to rescue the children from the house, the attempts proved to be insignificant. That fateful evening in Derby, 6 kind, caring and most importantly innocent children went to bed not knowing that they would never wake up. 2 grief-stricken parents sobbed in the street as the flames were put out and each child one by one was brought out and laid to rest on the grass in front of the house. This is literally the stuff that nightmares are made of. However, after every nightmare, you usually wake up and face reality. And the reality of this case is truly so much more disturbing than a deadly house fire breaking out. In today's episode, we will be covering the 2012 Derby arson attack and delving in to the shocking life of Mick Philpott. But quickly, people, I just want to take 2 seconds of your time and remind you of the channel memberships. We have so many of you now that have officially become part of the hardcore. You are members of the channel. That means that you are getting the videos up to 48 hours before they are put up on YouTube for the general public. And not only that, once a week you're getting an exclusive members only live stream. In that stream we interact with the members, we answer questions, we discuss the cases that we've covered, and each week we spill a bit of tea. We tell you lot exclusively what case we're going to be covering next. And not only that, a lot of the cases that we've so far covered have been member suggestions, so you really do have your chance to put an imprint on the channel. It's a small monthly fee, you can cancel at any time, and it helps us have the ability to bring this sort of content to you guys.
But before we get into this video proper, I just want to do a trigger warning for you guys. This is one of the most distressing cases that we have covered on the channel so far. This case has got stories of neglect, it's got stories of domestic abuse, and some stories that are far, far worse than that.
And as well as that, we want to take this opportunity to send our condolences and show remorse to Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jaden and Dwayne, who all very unfortunately perished that evening. Right, Josh, I know you've got a little timeline of events here. So starting off on the evening of the 10th, the kids go to bed upstairs, everything seems fine and well. And then into the early hours of the morning, obviously, a fire breaks out. What exactly happens, to your knowledge?
So the first point in this story that we really learn of stuff that's happened is 3:15 a.m. The police call is then made, and obviously we've heard that in the introduction. The fire brigade then attend the scene, and they make that in 4 minutes after that phone call. I've heard a lot of people dispute that, but it's really quickly after the phone call's made.
4 minutes is good timing.
It's really,
That's rapid.
really good timing. And what they discover when they arrive is a scene of absolute terror. And I don't think we can belittle how horrific this scene is, right? So you'll see pictures on screen right now, but basically what we're looking at is a semi-detached house, and it's a very normal suburban house, and what they've seen is just flames coming out of it and billowing smoke. I mean, this is one of the most significant fires that they've seen in a very, very long time, and the flames are engulfing the entire thing. So, neighbours rushed outside their homes as they'd heard screams and obviously seen the smoke and the fire all around the property. What they saw was a ladder that was propped up against one of the walls at the back of the house. Mick Philpott was heroically attempting to try and climb this ladder. He was breaking down windows in an attempt to get access to the property. Unfortunately, what he was met with was a scene of true horror. The smoke was so intense, the heat was so significant that he was unable to make his way safely into the home. So what that meant was neither Mick nor his partner Mairead managed to get into that house that evening at all. They were unable to do so. The firefighters were equipped to enter the home, and these guys are absolute legends with the amount of intense, serious conditions they had to deal with, and you've got to put it out to the firefighters. They managed to get into the property and were surprised with how quickly the fire had spread, especially between rooms on the ground floor, as you'd usually expect fire to rise directly upwards. They noticed that the floors above them were completely unstable. The entire ground floor was completely ablaze. They make their way upstairs, with great difficulty. So they make their way up to a back bedroom where they find all 6 of Mick and Mairead's children there.
Yeah, the tragic thing about this is that, despite Mick Philpott's attempts to climb to the window to be able to rescue the children, what he wouldn't have known at that time was the children were already unconscious from the smoke inhalation. And that's exactly what the firefighters found, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. And these guys, the kids, were wearing their normal clothes. They weren't even in pyjamas, which again was another thing that the firefighters were freaked out by. They managed to carry these kids down the stairs. They managed to get them out of the house. Bearing in mind the entire ground floor, as I say, is ablaze. And what they do is they lay them out on the front garden, which must have been just absolutely just gutting to even see that process happen. The neighbours have seen it. Obviously, Mick and Mairead have seen it as well. Yeah,
Mairead was described as being sort of just in a frenzy, really frantic. In as you could imagine any mother would be. Mick was described by neighbours as being a little bit more calm. I believe he walked over and kissed the forehead of one of his children and then sort of walked away from the scene. And I think that after this, obviously children are transported to where they need to go and whatnot. But the first question on everyone's lips would be, how has this happened? How has this fire broke out? Because, normally I would say the probably vast majority of house fires are unintentional. Would I be right to assume that?
Yeah, you'd say so. Usually it's like a chip pan fire or something like that.
The weird thing about this one is it broke out at 3:30 in the morning, and that's when most people are asleep, and most people definitely aren't cooking or doing anything like that in the kitchen. Obviously, of course, there can be electrical fires and whatnot. So I think the first thing what the police would have needed to do was quickly work out how this fire started.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, there were some giveaways straight away from this. Like the first thing that I was unsure about, mate, and you let me know if you thought this was weird as well, is there are 6 kids that are tucked up in their beds, but the 2 parents are safe and well outside. They don't seem to be covered in soot and smoke. They don't seem to have escaped the fire in a rush and had to go through horrific conditions. They just were out there in their normal attire and seemed very normal. It was something that immediately I was unsure of. Do you know what I mean?
Well, one of the things that people will point to is the fact that actually there was a caravan in the front garden. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that, but it was alleged that Mick Philpott used to sleep in that caravan, often with his wife Mairead, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about that. But that's one of the reasons why maybe they might have not been set ablaze or looked like that. I think that the police were and the fire services were very quickly able to identify the cause of the fire. It wasn't from cooking. It wasn't from, you know, an electrical fault or anything like that. It was from petrol, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Now, there was evidence all over the place that petrol was used as an accelerant. I mean, really, the base of the fire, or where the main element of the fire was kind of around the stairwell area, like very near the sort of the front of the property. And what firefighters were able to discern was that, yeah, petrol was strewn all over the ground floor.
So straight away, you've gone from what could seemingly be, you know, an innocent yet horrendous situation unfolding to something a lot more sinister, haven't you? Something that anyone with any common sense would understand is a deliberate act.
Yeah, exactly. And it wasn't just there, mate. They found stuff in the U-bend of the sink. They found petrol. Do you know what I mean? And also, a couple of streets away, they found a discarded petrol can and a glove as well that was associated with it.
So when you say it was in the sink, right?
The U-bend of the sink.
Yeah, so the U-bend of the sink would suggest that whoever has done this has had access to the home, because it's not just a case of, you know, petrol bomb through the letterbox, pouring petrol through the letterbox. If it's able to get in the sink, which we know was not near the front door, not in even throwing distance from the front door, and we know that from obviously documentaries and whatnot that we'll speak about where you see the layout of the house, we know that whoever has done this has been able to gain access to the house, haven't they?
Exactly that. And it wasn't just that, mate. There was also evidence on 2 people's clothing that later came out in the rest of the case, which we will get onto as well, which for me was an absolute giveaway. But why don't we talk about some other strange behaviour? Because there was a certain press conference very soon after this that we have to discuss.
First of all, I want to thank my 3 oldest children, because they helping us to cope with what's going on. And then there's a young lad called Daniel Stevenson who tried to get in the house the same as myself, and Joe across the road, and the Butler brothers. And of course there's the poor firemen, the police, the ambulances, the doctors, the nurses, literally everybody who tried to help save our children. They couldn't. Excuse me a minute. But there's one thing I would request is please leave my family alone. If you've got any questions or anything at all, please don't come through me or my family. Please go to the police, leave us alone and let us try and grieve in peace and quiet. That's all I ask. Thank you.
Right, it's always a tricky one to tackle this, Josh, but I want your first and initial thoughts. Very, very hard with hindsight. Very, very hard knowing that the probably majority, or at least half of the people viewing this video will have heard of the case, will know about the case. What was your initial reaction upon watching that press conference? Because it was high intensity, wasn't it? It was very, very emotional. Some might even use the word theatrical in a way.
Well, what you can never really suss out with grief is sometimes the way that people react. And obviously we've covered a lot of cases on this channel where people are grieving or potentially, you know, purporting to be grieving. And people do that in different ways, don't they?
Yeah.
What I thought was weird about this one is that you see both of them crying, and there's 2 body language things that I think we have to analyse. You know, Mairead is looking there and she's sort of got, you know, she's looking down. She never really looks up. She doesn't make eye contact with anyone in the room. She's sobbing the entire time, which absolutely could be part of grief. That's a very normal reaction. You would be hysterically crying. That is part of what has happened. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible action and an event that they've witnessed, right? So that's maybe explainable. But Mick next to her does all the talking, does all of the conversation, and he's dabbing his face constantly. And what police said at the time was that they didn't see any tears coming from his eyes.
Crocodile tears, they call it.
Yeah, and also there's a moment in which he sort of says, just give me a moment, just give me a moment. And again, when you're naturally crying, like you and I are criers, when you're naturally crying,
your voice breaks.
Your voice breaks, and then you say you've got a moment. Like it's uncontrollable.
And also, you don't, your breath your breath's taken from you. But another thing as well is, again, very, very hard to judge grieving parents. And regardless of whatever conclusion and outcome this case may have had, we cannot deny that these are grieving parents. They've lost children, right? But the main thing with me is, if I was to achieve something, if I was to win a title, if I was to accept an award, what's the first thing that I would probably go up to the stage and do?
Thank everyone.
I'd thank everyone. That's the first thing I'd do. I'd like to thank my team. I'd like to thank my coach. I'd like to thank my manager for the opportunity, for getting me here. I'd like to thank my friends and family for the support they've given me. That is something that, to me, is what you would do in terms of a situation where you know that you're the centre of attention and all eyes are on you, and you know you're sort of thanking people. And am I being pessimistic? It kind of felt to me like he was receiving an award in that opening sort of eulogy where he was thanking everyone and whatnot. And to me, it's like, as grateful as I would be, and we've commended the fire department,
They
like
need to be
not
commended.
only for what they did, for what they had to see,
Yeah.
and this is just one. This is a drop in the ocean of what they have to deal with. So absolute like praise goes to them, but I don't think in that state of mind, within a matter of days or whatever it was, I would be conscious enough to be thinking like that. But then maybe that's just me.
Well, no, because the purpose of the entire press conference was to try and find information about who may have caused this incident. And so really the only reason why you're even there as those parents is to go, look guys, this is a really, really serious situation. We're grieving parents. We're trying to find out information for who killed our children. It's a perilous, really difficult task to do, but you do get straight into it. You need to just get involved and find out the answers. And unfortunately, he didn't seem to do that. He spent a lot of time focusing on other stuff. So yeah, it was strange.
One thing though is when you see these press conferences, Sarah Payne's parents, Madeleine McCann's parents, so many, even Jay Slater's mum and whatnot. These are parents and people that for the first time ever are having a camera put on them, and therefore they're not used to it. They're not, it's even to an extent, God forbid anything ever had to happen with us, and it would be completely different circumstances. But where we've been in this industry and done podcasting and whatnot and TV work and stuff like that, I think that there might be that slight factor of understanding what it's like to have a camera on you. Mick Philpott was actually a man that understood quite well what it was like to have a camera on him. He was somewhat of a reality personality, and that was something that many people when watching the press conference didn't know, and many local people did know. So I think that this is probably the perfect time for me to give my little rundown on the life of Mick Philpott. So Mick Philpott was born in December 1956 in Derby. However, there's really not much known about his childhood. What we do know is that when he left school, he joined the army. And it was around this time, at the age of 19 years old, that Mick Philpott met 15-year-old Kim Hill, who he began a romantic relationship with. Josh, I've got to ask you a question, mate. 4-year age gap. Now, let's say, for example, I'm 31 this year, right? So let's say once I turn 31, would you judge me for entering a relationship with a 27-year-old woman?
No.
You wouldn't, would you?
But, Jerry, context is everything, isn't it?
And circumstances are everything. And the difference in maturity and in life experience, and also, most importantly, legality from 19 to 15 is very, very different, isn't it? So would that to you already ring major alarm bells?
I think it would be a serious alarm bell and an illegal bell being rung there. Absolutely.
Yeah. Weirdly, however, despite the age difference, Hill's family really liked Mick. Mick was, and this is the typical trait of some of these characters that you'll see us describe on this channel, Mick was a charismatic man. He was somewhat of a charmer. He was someone that I would say, especially prior in his earlier life, prior to things that we'll go on to discuss, I would say that more people liked than disliked. He was a charismatic person, and despite that age difference, Hill's family got on with Mick. They liked Mick. And I think a lot of it came from the fact that Kim's dad was actually an army man as well. So straight away, you bring another army man into the household, and I think they're going to have a sort of an instant connection, a bond, something to be able to bond over.
Yeah. See, the thing is, though, mate, it wasn't as harmonious as perhaps the start of the relationship seemed to be. Things got a lot darker, a lot quicker in that relationship.
Yes, definitely. Mick's sort of abusive, coercive, controlling tendencies started to emerge very, very quickly. Kim recalls Mick beating her, telling her what she could and couldn't wear, and even giving her times that she had to be home by. Now, one day, Kim tries to leave the house wearing something that Mick didn't agree with, and Mick shot Kim in the groin with a crossbow. That is a sentence that is mental to even say.
How the fuck has he even got a crossbow? Like, what is even going on here?
I've got no idea.
And also, I feel that, like, what we've got to caveat all of this with is, you know, these women are in such serious abusive relationships, and often in abusive relationships, it's very, very difficult to leave. But my God, when you're shot in the leg with a crossbow, you've got to get out of there as quickly as you can.
Well, mate, the abuse continues further than that, way further than that. Kim recalls once that Mick hit her in public with a pool cue. She said it was in front of a load of blokes in a local pub in Derby, and her nose started to bleed straight away, and no one did anything about it. So again, really concerning. Another time, Kim was looking after a friend's baby, and she didn't sort of like rush to Mick when he got in the front door or whatever. She's looking after this baby, and instead of seeing her looking after this baby, and I think what a lot of men would think would be, oh, okay, like, you know, Mick didn't have any kids at the time, oh, you know, she'd be a good parent or something like that, all right, it's nice, whatever. He took a hammer to her knee. He hit her in the knee with a hammer because he felt resentment that the baby was getting the attention and not him. Again, very, very psychotic behaviour.
She's just trapped at this point, isn't she? It's just absolutely gutting. I mean, I'm glad you said psychotic, because there's one thing that completely, you know, explains this man's behaviour, is that he was a complete and utter psychopath. Wasn't there stories that he was breaking her fingers as well? Did you hear about
bending
this?
her fingers back, breaking her fingers, things like that. And all the while, Kim is having to make up lies for how she got these injuries. And do you know who she's making up lies to?
Go on.
School teachers. Because this girl is still a child. This is the thing that we need to not gloss over. This is not a woman. This is a child that has been groomed and coerced into defending her neglectful partner, and neglectful is probably the wrong word, completely abusive partner. Eventually, however, the abuse does get too much and Kim leaves Mick Philpott. But, as you'll go on to find out from this story, Mick Philpott is not a man that can take no for an answer. He stalks Kim, hides and watches her until he knows both her and her family's exact routine, what time Kim comes home, and more importantly, what time her father is out. Now, in July 1978, Philpott seized his opportunity after seeing Kim's father leave the house and broke in. He stabbed Kim Hill 27 times, and after hearing the commotion, Kim's mother rushed to her daughter's aid, but upon doing so, Philpott then turned on her mother, stabbing her 11 times. Now, the details of this attack are somewhat vague, but what we do know is that the police were called, police and paramedics arrived at the scene. Now, 99% of the time, the attacker will flee the scene, but in, again, completely psychotic behaviour, what does Philpott do? He sits down on the staircase with the two of them bleeding out with serious life-threatening injuries upstairs. He's got the knife in his hand, and as the paramedics rush up to treat them, he says, "I wouldn't waste my time if I was you. She's a goner." Now that is truly chilling, isn't it?
It is, and these women were so badly injured, I don't think you can underestimate it. Basically, Kim ends up going into an ambulance, and during that time, she actually passed away twice on that journey. And through her, just unbelievable will to survive, she manages to pull through, and she ends up making it to the hospital in such a state where she might be able to just make it through. But she's got so many significant injuries. He'd slit through her stomach, which is usually an injury which you just pass away from, but that is a serious injury. And not only that, there were several serious and very important organs that were injured at the time as well. And these injuries affected both Kim and her mother's life significantly, so much so that the family have suggested that the mother passed away because of the scar tissue as a result of these injuries. Kim
it's not just the family, by the way. Sorry to interrupt you there.
Really?
It was doctors.
Was
that
it
suggested
doctors?
that
It was the scar tissue.
Doctors have suggested that as well. So realistically, although it happened years on, realistically, that's a life already that Mick Philpott has took. Now, Mick Philpott was very quickly arrested and sent to trial, where he was found guilty of attempted murder and grievous bodily harm. 21-year-old Philpott was sentenced to just 7 years in prison for this attack. Have a guess how many years in prison out of the 7 for this attack he did.
It's never the full sentence, and it's usually about half. So can I say 3.5 years, bearing in mind that we know the criminal justice system based on doing these episodes?
Yep. So he did 3 years.
Yeah, and 6 months.
No, he did 3 years and 2 months. And
This
do you know
is
what?
a
Do you know
joke.
what that equates exactly to?
Go on.
Mick Philpott served 1 month for each stab wound to his victim.
Can we just say that this is a failure in terms of the sentencing, and also I think the crimes in which he was convicted of? Like, basically attempted murder. He's literally sat there with a knife at the bottom of the stairs, said what he said, like basically, don't go and try and save them, I've done a good one on them. And he's got away with attempted murder. And then the sentence for attempted murder, he only does 3 years. Like, what world are we living in, mate, where we can get away with stuff like that? He's like basically tried to kill 2 people.
Yep.
And nearly succeeded, and basically ended up killing, one of them in the long run anyway.
Yeah.
It's a disgrace.
Yeah, it is. Now, after being released from prison, Mick Philpott met and married a woman named Pamela Lomax. They had 2 sons and a daughter together. However, the stint in prison hadn't changed Mick. It hadn't made him reevaluate the way that he looked at women, reevaluated the way that he treated women or his behaviour towards them. And Lomax very quickly became the victim of domestic abuse. Now, in the knowledge of what Mick Philpott had done to his previous partner, which it's reported he consistently reminded Lomax of, she was just too afraid to leave him. She was too scared that she would suffer a similar fate, or maybe even a fatal outcome. And therefore, she decided that her best course of action would just be to put up with Mick Philpott and to hope that his wandering eye and his ways that he had clearly shown in the past would come to surface, and that he would leave her, he would find someone else, and he would move on. And despite having to wait what can only be described as a horrendous decade in terms of violence, domestic abuse and whatnot, that was eventually what happened with Pamela Lomax, because Mick Philpott did meet someone new. At the age of 37 years old, Mick Philpott met, groomed and started a relationship with 14-year-old Heather Keogh.
So basically there was a lake near the house of Mick, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And he ended up seeing these, I think there were 2 girls that would often sort of go down to the lake. You know what teenagers are like. Basically they want to try and get out of the house and have their own sort of space.
It was a fishing lake primarily.
There you go.
But obviously it kind of became a hangout for
spot
teenagers and whatnot.
And you know what teenagers are like? They're quite easily manipulated with getting drugs, drink, cigarettes, that sort of thing, right? And the master manipulator that Mick was, he sort of asserts this and understands that. Like, basically what you've done throughout his entire relationship life is that Mick has gone for, you know, susceptible, you know, women that he deems to be easily abused and managed, right? This is a sort of, again, a constant reminder of his own psychopathy and the way that he's grooming these women. It's so incredibly gutting to see this back, because you see this sort of repeat pattern of behaviour.
And not only that, like, unlike a lot of predators, he hasn't initially rushed straight in. What he's done is actually took time to analyse the behaviour and try and get a grasp on these children or women's personalities, and then see how he can kind of mould himself into someone that could fit into their life, someone that could offer them something. And obviously in this case, he was offering them the allure of being the man that would go to the shops for them and buy them alcohol, buy them cigarettes, probably bring them drugs and things like this. And he became sort of an older part of the crowd that would hang out with them, wouldn't he? And this culminated eventually in him starting a underage relationship with Heather, and really, really, really distressing situation here. Eventually, Heather would fall for Mick. She was groomed, she was brainwashed. One night when he was night fishing at the lake, you know, he takes his tent and whatnot, and a 14-year-old Heather loses her virginity to Mick Philpott in that tent. The two would then run away together on Heather's 16th birthday. Once again, a very calculated move from predator Philpott, as he knew that he could deny any wrongdoing and claim, well, the girl's of legal age. Now, although reportedly Mick initially considered abducting or trying any way he could to gain custody of his 3 children with Kim Hill, this was to no prevail. Hill would not budge. She was adamant that the children would not be subjected to any of what she went through. And eventually, Mick just gave up, leaving those 3 children behind. But it was fine for Mick, because as one door closes, another door opens. And for Mick Philpott, those doors came in the form of children. He had 2 kids with Heather. That is 5 in total, if you include the 3 children that he left behind. And let's be honest, 6 if you include Heather, who was still a child at the time. But if you thought that maybe Mick Philpott had now found peace and would become a changed man in his new life that he had picked for himself, you were very, very wrong. Mick's behaviour continued. He actually had 2 sons with Heather, and he was so angry that she didn't produce him a baby girl, something that is obviously completely out of her control. He subjected her to emotional and physical abuse and many accounts of. Even worse than this, and again, just psychotic, Mick raised those boys to emotionally and physically abuse their mother as well. He taught them to swear at their mother. He taught them to hit their mother. He taught them to be really, really violent towards their mum, which again is just sick psychology from this man. However, finally, after 6 years of putting up with the abuse from Mick Philpott, Heather fled the house into the arms of police. She was moved in to a new home, and the boys were moved into that house with her.
But once again, we see with Mick, there is another pattern of behaviour. We've talked about this very briefly before, but he would stalk these women even after they had managed to escape from him. And this was a common trait of his own psychopathy. He would constantly be trying to win them back or trying to control them in a way that if they ever left him, that was such a slight on his own personality and his own narcissistic tendencies that it would be a direct insult to him, and he just couldn't let that happen. His obsessive behaviour became so serious that really he should have been tried and convicted of stalking. But really, again, like in all of these cases, another set of police failures, he never actually was. But again, much like his pattern of behaviour, Mick very soon found the love and attention of another woman that he felt that he could control. This time, he was 44 years old and he met a new young partner. She was only 19 at the time. Her name was Mairead Duffy. She had a very tough life in her own right. Again, apparently being the act of abuse in her childhood. And again, Mick identified and groomed her because of how easily manipulated she was. And he started another act of torment and another relationship of pain with her.
Yeah, and Mairead fell head over heels for Mick straight away, didn't she? Like, apparently it was a non-abusive relationship to start with. That doesn't mean it didn't have its complications, which we'll go into. But one of the things she liked about Mick as well was how welcoming he was to her own son. She had a son from that previous abusive relationship. And obviously, once again, Mick sized up what he had in front of him and moulded himself on the surface into what he believed he needed to be to gain these women's sort of trust. However, I spoke about those complications, right? And one of them was that a year after meeting and coupling up with Mairead, Mick Philpott meets another woman. She was a 16-year-old girl, shock horror, called Lisa Willis. Willis was a single mother. She was an orphan. She very soon became Mick's mistress, but she didn't become Mick's secret mistress. Mick was so confident in his authority in the household, he decided to just be completely open with Mairead and say that, you know, not only have I got another woman in my life, we're going to make the bizarre move of moving her into the house and having her come and live with us.
Yeah, some people call that a polyamorous relationship, but a polyamorous relationship is between all three people. Mick wouldn't allow the women to have a relationship between each other. So the family dynamics were as simple as this. Mick saw himself as the man of the house, the guy with the two girlfriends, and they were there to do the bidding of him. They did all of the housework. They did all of the cleaning. They looked after all of the children. And Mick would just stand there. Now, the one thing that we haven't discussed so far, Joey, is that Mick's not a working man. Mick is not out there earning the family, living, feeding after all the kids.
He's looking after the kids.
Oh, sorry, he's looking after all the kids.
How can you be a working man when you've got that many kids to look after?
Stay-at-home father.
There you go.
It's very 21st century.
Yeah, there you go. He kind of brought it into fashion, didn't he?
He did.
There you go.
He did.
He was the founder of the Stay-at-Home Dads Club.
Yeah, he was.
Although when we say staying at home, I'll just touch on it quickly because we said we'd get back to it at the start of the intro. He wasn't always in the home. We mentioned the caravan that was in the front garden. Now, I just want to speak about this now. Imagine growing up in that household, right? These kids probably go to school. These kids probably go round to their friends, or at least, you know, hear about the home life of their friends. And you would imagine that their friends would have a very, very different dynamic to the house life of the Philpott children. Because Mick would sleep in that caravan outside, and from night to night, admittedly by himself, by the way, sometimes twice in one night, he would have either Mairead or Lisa in the caravan with him, pretty much to have sex. And remembering that this is a semi-detached house, as you say, houses either side of this, you're in a caravan in the front garden. You're basically openly having sex in public, aren't you?
Yes, you are. And I think the family dynamics were so fascinating to so many people that it does sort of tend to go a little bit further and wider than the neighbours, perhaps.
Now, Mick obviously was with Mairead about a year before Lisa came into the picture, and Mick wanted to get married. Mick wanted to marry Mairead, and obviously in the UK, you can only have one wife. Although Mick did refer to both as his wives, you can only have one wife legally, and Mick chose to marry Mairead. So Lisa got the, in essence, runners-up medal, didn't she? She got to be the bridesmaid at the wedding. So by 2007, Mick and Mairead and Lisa are living in a 3-bedroom council flat with 9 children. 4 born to Mairead, 3 born to Willis, and 2 from each woman's previous relationship. Bearing in mind, Mick also had another 5 that he was no longer in contact with. But with the toll now rising to 14 children, Mick wanted more.
So he obviously he loved his kids.
Yeah.
didn't he? Do you know what I mean?
He loved other people's kids as well, by all accounts. But it wasn't out of love of children at all. Mick was a player of the benefit system, wasn't he?
Yes.
And he worked out that the more children, the more benefits you can claim. And do you know what the average salary around that time in the UK was? And especially, we speak about average salary, obviously it's contextualised by what area you live in. In that area of Derby, do you know what the average salary was?
I think, wasn't it less than like 18 grand? Wasn't it something?
It was definitely under £20,000 per year for a full-time 9-to-5 worker before tax, right? Do you know how much Mick Philpott was getting in benefits?
This amount is going to make you so angry when you hear it. It's £60,000 a year in benefits this guy was making from the kids. Now, what people might say is he deserves that kind of money because he's raising the kids, he's looking after them, he's feeding them, clothing them, making sure they get to school, making sure they're looked after.
Burning down the house.
But the thing is, Joey, is that he wasn't doing any of that. He had flat screen TVs. He had several game consoles. He was sitting around, enjoying his life. He wasn't working. He wasn't looking after his wife and girlfriend, we should say. And he wasn't looking after the kids. They would often have to eat burgers and chips and often would go hungry. They weren't being fed properly. So none of this money was going towards them.
And it was around this time that the council started to realise that Mick's motivation for having children was purely financial. And it was around this time that Mick realised that the council had realised this and they were not willing to accommodate this. And therefore, Mick hatched another one of his master plans. What he would then do is go to the media to complain about his living situations. And I don't know whether, nowadays, I think people understand that controversy sells, and what do they call it? Is it rage bait and things like that?
Yeah, rage bait.
Whereas I don't necessarily think that Mick Philpott knew he was doing that. I think that Mick Philpott honestly thought that people would see him and
sympathise with him.
This man does deserve a house big enough for all his children. But obviously, it went the other way. It started with local media outlets that would, tell the story of this man and his two wives that he wasn't ashamed to say he had and their children. And it culminated in him actually getting on some really big TV shows. Starting off, there was a TV show that he did with Anne Widdecombe. And basically the show would revolve around Anne Widdecombe going to stay with Mick Philpott and his family and pretty much assessing the situation of what was going on.
And also
there.
trying to get him a job. That was the key premise of the show, because this guy's sat around doing absolutely nothing. And Widdecombe actually ends up finding him 3 jobs. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Yeah,
no.
She ended up finding him 3 jobs and he declined taking any of them. So
Of course. But the concerning thing as well, for anyone who didn't know the background on Mick Philpott, was, in my opinion, the way he behaved towards Anne Widdecombe. Now, I would describe Anne Widdecombe at the time as an elderly lady, or definitely of that sort of age. And there's a point now that we'll show you in this clip from the documentary that really summarises Mick Philpott's underlying behaviour.
You're a coward.
Let's do as a coward, bitch. Let's move it.
And the way he jumps up there towards Anne Widdecombe, and by the way, fair play to Anne Widdecombe standing
she didn't
her
even
ground.
flinch.
No.
She was, I respect that.
She was not scared of Mick.
No,
she's not a woman that is easily scared, Anne
Yeah.
Widdecombe, right? But the way that he jumped up there to Anne Widdecombe, he instinctively for a second realised that the camera's on and he controlled himself. But that there is enough for me, and I'm not claiming to be an expert, that there was enough for me to go, woman beater.
Yeah.
If I had no idea on his background,
100%.
woman beater.
He calls her a bitch as well, which is just a joke. Like, apparently he was calling both his wife and his partner that as well. It's just a disgrace.
Right? You don't speak to a bird like that,
Yep.
for a start. You do not speak to a woman like that, right? If you've got any brains about you, by the way, and you do care what people think of you, which Mick clearly does, you don't speak to a woman like that on TV. You shouldn't do it behind closed doors, but you definitely don't do it on TV. But not only that, again, I come back to the age factor here and whatnot. You don't speak to a woman of Anne Widdecombe's
just don't
age.
do it,
Like
period.
it's
He's outed
just
himself so
manners,
obvious. Yeah, yeah.
behaviour. It's just so transparent there. And the thing I want to ask you, Josh, is I can't see Anne Widdecombe being complicit to take part in this documentary had she have known of Mick Philpott's previous convictions and prison time. And we don't know the answer to this. We've tried to research, we've tried to find out and whatnot. Yeah. But would you agree with me? Because I strongly suspect that Anne Widdecombe had no idea of his past and history.
She couldn't have done. The way that she conducted herself in the documentary and the way that she's so close to him and in his family environment, I just can't imagine it. There's scenes, mate, where she's in the kitchen. Do you know what I mean? Like near all the kitchen knives and things like that. Like that, she wouldn't have been safe, and the producers wouldn't have allowed it either for this old lady to be involved in this. So yeah, super strange, mate. But it wasn't just that, was it? He was also on other TV shows, and perhaps one of the most famous clips of this guy is on the Jeremy Kyle show. Infamous at that time. I would say Jeremy Kyle was in its peak at this time in terms of daytime viewership, the amount of people that were watching him. And this guy goes on this show. Jeremy Kyle lays into him basically for not having a job and for basically mistreating these girls. But this guy is loving it. He's parading both of his partners on stage. He's making out that he's, Billy Big Bollocks and he's the one in control here. And he's trying to go at Jeremy Kyle, but Jeremy Kyle just sort of sits him down and tells him to shut up, doesn't he?
You don't work.
Oh, yes, I do work.
Yeah, I know your argument on this. Just give it to us. You say I look after my kids. What's wrong with a man looking after his kids other than a woman?
That's correct. What is wrong with a man looking after his children? I mean, I'm old-fashioned. I believe the man should be at work, but unfortunately, because the media keeps putting this certain story in the paper, I cannot get a job.
I complimented your kids. I complimented your kids, and I sat and listened to you, and all I was saying was how good they looked. You have jumped out of your box with one hell of a chip on your shoulder. You haven't even had anybody say anything to you so far, and you're making signs. No. You've no reason to do that. But I'll tell you something. When a grown man who purports to be a good father, probably he is, sits on national television and does that, no wonder you can't get a damn job.
And despite Mick being portrayed as a scrounger, some might even say a villain, he loved the notoriety. He loved the newfound fame that it brought along with him. By 2012, Lisa Willis had finally had enough of being the mistress and being mistreated, so she plucked up the bravery to leave Mick. She gathered her children and said that she would be taking them swimming. However, this was just a plan to get them out of the house, and once doing so, she and the children fled. This angered Mick immensely. He was furious at Lisa, and there's no prizes for guessing who he took it out on. He physically assaulted Mairead, but he wasn't most angry at the fact that Lisa had left him. He was angriest at the fact that there was now less children in the house, less benefits, and therefore a legal battle would commence whereby Mick would attempt to get his children back. But there's a problem here, Josh, isn't there? Mick Philpott knows that as soon as the police look into his background, there's no way he's getting those children back. So he had to come up with something even more inventive, didn't he? He did. And the plan that he hatched shows more than anything his own psychopathy, because basically what he decided to do was start a house fire. A house fire that he would blame on Lisa Willis. And being that it was in the early hours of the morning, this house fire literally took place on the day of the court date. And it was done so to not only portray Mick as the hero that saved his children, but to show Lisa as the evil mother who was unfit to look after the safety of those children. The thing is, though, Lisa had an alibi. Lisa was arrested by police. Can you imagine this? This poor woman that was abused for so many years, being swept up by police, interrogated, asked all these questions, completely innocent. Yeah. But the thing is, she had an alibi. And by the way, a woman that's grieving. Yeah. A woman that's grieving herself. Remember, she lived in the household with these kids. Now, she has no authority or right to take any children that aren't biologically hers, but that doesn't mean she wouldn't have had attachments. We very much saw that both women looked after all of the kids. We saw that in the documentaries and whatnot. So this is a grieving woman as well, knowing that 6 children that she spent so much time with have now have now perished.
Yes, and this really is where the master plan by Mick apparently started, right? So what he starts doing at the scene when he's seen his 6 children sort of there, trapped in the house, he's already speaking to neighbours and he's saying, oh, Lisa was out to get me. Lisa was this jealous partner. She's the one that's to blame for this. And this is what we didn't even talk about. Mairead is sat there apparently, in traumatic circumstances, crying. He's out there trying to dob someone else in, already making excuses. And again, really exposing himself for what it was.
Not only that, after the children's bodies were taken away, obviously they had to be identified by the parents. And Mick acted very, very strangely when he went to identify the bodies.
Yep.
There was an account of him putting someone in a headlock and joking around, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was a lot of what he would deem to be horseplay, but in a very serious situation, it was just ridiculous. He ended up taking a neighbour with him because basically Mairead didn't want to go into the morgue, and rightly so, having to face what she'd done. But the neighbour supported him. Apparently, the neighbour's in floods of tears. He's absolutely distraught, and you would be in the scene that you're confronting yourself with. But Mick apparently was not acting like that at all. He wanted to get in and get out and get on with his day, and it's just a disgrace.
And what we haven't mentioned is that the oldest child that was in the house, which was Dwayne, obviously he wasn't biologically mixed, he was from a past relationship. He initially survived and died in the days that followed, but he was in hospital for a period of time, and when he was in the hospital, Mick Philpott is alleged to have flirted with nurses and was even alleged to have grabbed hold of a nurse's bottom in one of the hospitals and said, that's what I like. Not only that, they complained that they weren't being given free food in the hospital, and they said, that the staff basically told them, look, well, the food that we give out is for the patients. And do you know what they said? They said that they wanted the food and it was a disgrace. Mate, do you not know this? Go on. Mick Philpott said, well, Dwayne's in a coma, so he's not eating. It's just so wrong, isn't it? Could you imagine? It's just so wrong. Imagine being a parent and saying that? Dwayne's in a coma, so he's not eating, so surely that's one meal that's going. In the end, though, they ordered a Chinese. They did. To the hospital. And they ended up having a food fight, apparently, in one of the waiting rooms. It is ridiculous. I mean, if police are not already suspecting him based on just that behaviour alone, then I don't know what is. I don't know what you could, judge it on. So I mentioned police and the case that they were building against Mick, but there was a lot of evidence that they found. Obviously, they found information and evidence all around the petrol that was all over the house. And they also found evidence that petrol can was placed in very close proximity. And again, that was linked to Mick. They also found that Mick had actually got petrol on his clothing, and they even were able to use sort of chemical evidence to match traces of that to the petrol that was used in the house. Mick then concocted a crazy story that he'd had that petrol from an incident 3 months ago, but again, police found the evidence and proved that it was from the actual scene at the time. Police also used the suspicious timing as a potential motive as well, and they also used Lisa Willis's testimony against Mick in the case against him. But it wasn't just that. Police also had a series of covert recordings from inside the hotel room that they had hired and rented while the Philpotts were unable to stay in their burnt out home. There were several quotes from these recordings that were incredibly incriminating.
He was heard saying things like, are we sticking to the story? What did you tell the police? What did you tell? How badly did you cry? Did you really cry your eyes out?
What did you cry when you were saying it? How bad?
Not really bad, but I did cry.
That's so cool.
Now, it wasn't just Mairead that assisted Mick in this incident. They also had another accomplice called Paul Mosley, who was a family friend and a guy that often frequented this house.
Yes, so we don't really know what Paul Mosley stood to benefit from this. You would imagine something financial.
I mean, there was a sexual connection, wasn't there, with Mairead as well? Like, apparently these guys were having, threesomes. But there was alleged that they were having a threesome on the night of the incident.
It happened. And Mick Philpott, by the way, was a big fan of dogging as well. There was reports that one of his wives at the time got pregnant from another man dogging, and the baby was aborted by Mick himself. So just a sick fucker, mate, a sick fucker. As for Mosley himself, the motives weren't really understood, but it was very much proven in court that he was the man that assisted. So between the three of them, they had hatched up this plan and carried it out.
Now, apparently the plan was always to have the kids be saved, and for Mick to be the sort of the hero of the hour that would, you know, come in, use the ladder as I described at the start of the episode, and be able to go in there and get the kids out of their bedrooms. But obviously the plan didn't go to plan, and so the children again ended up dying. But what this meant was that the police and the barristers could not charge them with murder, so they ended up getting away with a lot lighter sentence, didn't they?
Absolutely mental.
Yeah,
absolutely mental. Because at the end of the day, like, manslaughter or not, I believe when something is calculated, you know the risk that you're taking. So it's really weird. Like, you'll get certain situations of, you know, you'll hear of like one-punch killers and stuff like that, fights that will happen outside nightclubs and stuff like that and whatever, and someone will fall and bang their head on a curb, and someone will get a manslaughter charge rather than a murder charge. And as much as I can so much sympathise with the families of victims that have had things like this happen, I can understand why that is a manslaughter charge. I can very much understand it, because it's a heat of the moment thing. It's not calculated, and obviously each individual circumstance and situation is different, but it's not calculated, and it is what it is. But what I can't understand is when it's a plan that's been hatched and it's calculated, and you understand, no matter how thick you are, you understand that you're putting your children at risk. I just can't believe that they didn't get murder charges here. Now, obviously, Mairead and Paul Mosley were both sentenced to 17 years respectively. Mick Philpott was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Little is known about Mairead and Mosley's time in prison, apart from the fact that they each only served 7 years and were released in 2020. Mick, however, still remains in prison at HMP Wakefield, where he will be eligible for parole in 2028, just 3 years from now at the time of recording. And this doesn't necessarily mean that Mick Philpott is going to get out of prison in 3 years, but one thing that I find baffling is the decision is made on the sole question of, does Mick Philpott pose a serious threat to society and to the public? And this means that his background, his history, his previous prison sentence may not even be taken into account when making this decision. What they might do is look at this OAP, by this time elderly man, in front of them and make the decision on whether or not he is a threat to society. In my opinion, whether or not he's a threat to society has fuck all to do with things. You did what you did, and you deserve to rot in that prison until you take your last breath. Now, one thing we do know is that a year or so ago, Mick Philpott was on the end of quite a savage prison beating. He was put in hospital, but he wasn't left with any life-threatening injuries, anything like that. And now it's reported that he spends a lot of time in his cell in fear for his safety. So that, ladies and gentlemen, pretty much brings us to the end of the Derby arson attack and the Mick Philpott story. Obviously, this has been an emotional episode. It's been one that, you know, we've had to discuss some really, really uncomfortable things. And most importantly, I think that this is a time that we want to pay homage, pay tribute and our respects to those that were obviously affected and those who passed away in this incident. Jade, John, Jack, Jesse, Jaden and Dwayne, may their souls rest in peace. If you did make it to the end of this episode and you are enjoying the content coming out of the channel, please do us a massive favour and hit that subscribe button. Hit a like on the video right now. And most importantly, let us know what case you want to see us cover in the next episode. We will see you all in the next one.